I was returning to my parents' house for the first time in several years. This time, the occasion was special. Their anniversary, the 30th year of their marriage. With me was Jake, my husband, who had immersed himself in work the moment we stepped into the house. His gaze rarely left the phone screen, and occasionally he glanced at something on his tablet, leaving me alone with my memories. The house felt both unfamiliar and overly familiar at the same time. I walked slowly down the hallway, pausing at each room. My parents' bedroom, still as neat as ever, with their old floral-patterned bedspread. My old room, now a guest room, with no trace of it ever having been mine. Even the wallpaper had been changed. The kitchen, the heart of family life, where Mom, of course, was already busy preparing something special, rolling out dough on a wooden board just as she always had. "Emma, look at you, how you've grown," Mom exclaimed, hugging me as if she hadn't seen me in years. She gave Jake a brief hug, but quickly turned her attention back to me. "How are you? Ready for tomorrow's celebration?" "Of course, Mom," I replied with a smile, though a strange sense of tension was building inside me. Jake merely nodded, his focus unwavering from his work. His detachment was so familiar now that I barely noticed how infrequent our real conversations had become. He was there, but it was as if he were behind glass. I tried not to dwell on it. "Can you take a break for at least today?" I asked him, hoping for a warm response. "Later, Em. I need to finish a couple of things," he said without looking up. I stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. A light rain had dampened the concrete path leading to the gate, and the cool autumn breeze played with the leaves. A black SUV drove past, catching the corner of my eye. Its silhouette felt vaguely familiar, and an unexpected sense of unease crept over me. It's just an evening at my parents' house, I thought, trying to reassure myself. But deep inside, shadows from the past I neither expected nor sought were already stirring. The evening was in full swing when the guests started to arrive. The house, quiet just a few hours ago, was now filled with the hum of conversations, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Mom, in her signature apron, darted between the kitchen and the living room, making sure everyone had food and drinks. Jake, though he tried to appear engaged, eventually found a quiet corner to dive back into his work. I stood by the window, watching the string lights twinkle in the garden, when a voice behind me made me turn. "Emma? Is that really you?" The words were warm yet unexpected. I turned and froze. Standing before me was Eric. Tall, self-assured, with the same spark in his eyes that had once made me both nervous and giddy at the same time. But now he looked older, more mature, with faint lines on his face that spoke of years of experience. His dark suit fit him perfectly, and his smile was just as I remembered. Slightly ironic, yet dangerously captivating. "Eric," I said, feeling a slight wave of unease rise within me. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't know I'd be back either," he replied, lowering his gaze as though he had more to say but held back. "But your parents' anniversary is a great occasion. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" I nodded, trying to mask my emotions. The last time we had crossed paths was years ago, back in school. He had been the one I considered my first love, until life took us in different directions. "How are you? What are you up to these days?" I asked, defaulting to a polite question to break the pause. "Working, trying not to get too caught up in it," he said with a small laugh. "Moved back to town to try something new. Business is great, but sometimes you crave something real, you know? And you? Are you happy?" That question caught me off guard. He asked it casually, almost lightly, but there was something deeper in his gaze. I looked away, feeling my usual composure start to crack under his piercing eyes. "Everything's fine," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I have a good family, a job, the usual." Eric nodded, though it seemed my brief answer didn't convince him. "Good to hear," he said with a faint smile, but there was a strange note of regret in his tone. The conversation didn't last long, but something about it stirred memories I thought I had long buried. When Eric stepped away to join a group of other guests, I could still feel his gaze lingering on me. It was as if he had touched a part of me I had been avoiding. Jake came over later, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You look pensive. Is everything okay?" he asked, but without waiting for an answer, he returned to his phone. I glanced at Eric, now standing by the window, chatting with another guest. There was an ease and confidence in his movements that I had once adored. And in that moment, I realized this was only the beginning. The party was in full swing. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and it seemed that everyone in the house, except me, felt completely at ease. I searched for a way to distract myself from my thoughts, from the way Eric kept appearing in my peripheral vision, and from the growing tension inside me. Quietly, I slipped out of the living room and onto the terrace. It was peaceful here. The cold autumn air hit my face, and the damp aroma of the night garden stirred a strange mix of comfort and loneliness within me. I leaned on the railing, staring into the darkness, trying to gather my thoughts. "Not bored, are you?" A familiar voice broke through my reverie. I turned around. Eric stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. His gaze was soft, yet too intent, as if he were trying to read my thoughts. "No," I lied, turning away. "Just needed some air." "I see," he said, stepping onto the terrace. His movements were light, just as I remembered. Eric approached, but kept enough distance not to intrude on my space. "You know, I always liked this place. Back in school, whenever I needed to think, I'd sometimes come here." I looked at him, surprised. "You came here? To my parents' house?" He chuckled lightly. "Of course not. But I used to walk around here near the neighborhood. This area always felt special, like everything here was more real. I don't know if I'm explaining it well," he said, shrugging, a faint hint of self-consciousness showing. I laughed unexpectedly. "You haven't changed a bit." "Have you?" His question came out serious. I didn't know how to respond. Of course I'd changed. A married woman now, with a career and a life consumed by the bustle of the city. I wasn't the naive girl I used to be. But why did it feel in his presence like all those changes were just a thin veneer covering the old version of me? "Everyone changes," I said shortly, hoping to end the topic. Eric nodded, though his eyes lingered on me a moment longer than they should have. "Do you remember how we used to dream about leaving this town?" he asked suddenly. I kept wondering where you wanted to go back then. New York? Paris? It doesn't matter. I tried to wave it off. Those were just childish fantasies. Everyone thinks there's something better out there beyond their hometown. "But you did leave," he said with a slight smile. "So you must have believed in it." It was so typical of him. That teasing tone, but beneath it, something deeper. I felt a growing contradiction inside me, the urge to leave this terrace and the equal desire to stay. "And you left too," I reminded him. "Did it work out for you?" Eric paused, looking out toward the garden. "On the surface, yes, but inside—" He hesitated. "Sometimes it feels like something important is still missing. Maybe it's just age catching up." I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter ground. "Age? Seriously? We're not that old." Eric laughed, but then looked at me with a quiet seriousness. "Sometimes I think age isn't about the years. It's about how far we've drifted from who we used to be." His words made me freeze. Thoughts spun in my head like a whirlwind. Were we now the people we once dreamed of becoming? Or had our dreams long since been replaced by compromises? Sensing the intensity of my reaction, Eric stepped back slightly, as if giving me space. "All right, I won't keep you any longer," he said, heading back into the house. But at the doorway, he turned around. "If you need anything, I'm always here to help, whatever it might be." His words hung in the air, leaving behind a strange sense of unfinished business. I remained on the terrace, staring out into the night. The next morning was bustling with activity. Mom was fully absorbed in preparations for the celebration, and of course, something had been forgotten. Emma, sweetheart, we need to pick up a few things for dinner, she said, handing me a list. Do you mind? I didn't. In fact, it was a welcome excuse to get out of the house where the air seemed to grow heavier by the minute. As I was getting ready, Eric's voice drifted in from the living room. I can drive you if you'd like. I've got some free time. Mom turned, smiling. What a great idea. Eric, would you be so kind? Emma, he'll take you. It's fine. I can go myself, I protested, but Mom waved a dismissive hand. Don't be stubborn. He's already driving. I wanted to refuse, but Eric was already looking at me with that faint smile as if this moment had been inevitable. Shall we? He said, his tone making it sound less like a question and more like a statement. His car was spacious and impeccably clean, carrying the faint scent of new leather. I settled into the passenger seat, trying to keep my demeanor calm. For the first few minutes, silence filled the car, broken only by the soft hum of music from the speakers. Finally, Eric spoke. You've always seemed like someone who's got everything under control, he said, casting a quick glance at me. But last night on the terrace, you seemed different. I tensed, unsure how to respond. Different? In what way? He shrugged lightly, like someone trying to convince herself that everything's fine. And you think it's not? I countered, keeping my tone neutral. Eric smirked, but there was no lightness in his smile. I'm just curious if you're happy. That's all. His words felt like they reached into a part of me I didn't let anyone, not even myself, touch. I looked at him, but he was focused on the road, his expression unreadable. Of course I'm happy, I said sharply. Everything's fine. Fine isn't happiness, Emma, he said calmly, his eyes still on the road. That statement echoed in my mind. I turned to the window, watching the trees blur past, trying to hide the emotions beginning to stir inside me. At the store, Eric stayed close. As we moved through the aisles, he carried the basket while I tried to concentrate on the list, but his presence was palpable. Every movement, every question he asked, heightened the tension between us. Remember how we used to go to that old store near school? He asked suddenly as I picked out some fruit. I remember, I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the apples. We'd always get soda and candy. And then sit on that bench in the park, he continued. We could sit there for hours, talking about anything and everything. His voice was soft, tinged with nostalgia that made me uncomfortable. These weren't just casual memories, they carried weight. Eric, that was a long time ago, I said softly, hoping to put an end to it. It was, he agreed. But does that make those moments any less real? His words hung in the air, an unspoken question lingering between us. I didn't reply. Instead, I headed to the checkout, silently willing the trip to end. On the drive back, the tension in the car was almost tangible. Eric broke the silence only once. You haven't stopped dreaming, have you? I wanted to reply with something sharp, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned back to the window, letting the silence settle between us. It felt safer than the words we might exchange. As we drove back, Eric suddenly veered off the main road. Eric, where are you going? I asked warily, watching the trees outside grow denser and the road less familiar. There's a place I know you'll remember, he said, his eyes fixed on the road. We haven't been there in years. I realized where he was taking me even before the familiar outlines of the abandoned park came into view. Once, this place was vibrant, filled with bright attractions, children's laughter, and joyful shouts. Now, it was cloaked in silence and decay. Rusted swings creaked softly in the wind, and the pathways were overgrown with weeds. Why are we here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Just wanted to remember, he said, stepping out of the car and gesturing for me to follow. I hesitated, but curiosity ultimately won. We walked along a narrow, leaf-strewn path. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying foliage. Eric didn't speak, but his presence felt heavy. as if he were saying everything without uttering a word. We reached the old bench, the same one where we'd spent countless hours talking. It looked the same but worn down by time. The wood was darkened and the paint had peeled away. "Do you remember this place?" he asked at last, sitting on the edge of the bench. "Of course I do," I replied softly, remaining standing. "This is where we used to talk about wanting to leave, about wanting something more." "And?" He looked up at me. "Did you find your something more?" I lowered my gaze, feeling his words hit deeper than I wanted them to. Too many questions in the past few days, too many emotions I had tried to suppress. "You can't just come crashing into my life with questions like that," I said, trying to steady the tremble in my voice. Eric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why not?" "We knew each other better than anyone else ever did." "Isn't that true?" I couldn't answer. Memories surged like a wave. Our talks about the future, our dreams of changing the world, of becoming who we wanted to be. It all felt so distant, but with him, the past became tangible again. "I'm just trying to understand who we've become," he said after a long pause. "We all make choices, but have you ever wondered what it would have been like if you'd chosen differently?" I froze. It was too raw, too intimate a question. Inside, two parts of me clashed, one wanting to stay in the safety of my current life, the other daring to confront this moment. "Eric," I began, but my voice faltered. "It's pointless. The past is the past." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze carrying not just words, but emotions he couldn't express aloud. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But sometimes it comes back to remind you that you might have left something behind." I turned away, hiding the tears welling in my eyes. The past was returning, and his voice, his gaze, awakened things I thought I had buried long ago. By evening, the house was filled with guests. The glow of the string lights created a cozy dimness, and the hum of laughter and conversations drowned out everything else. But to me, it all felt like a haze. Eric's words, his questions, and his gaze at the abandoned park continued to echo in my mind. I spotted Jake weaving through the crowd with a glass of wine in his hand. His expression was intent, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't ignore. He approached me and leaned in, speaking quietly. "Is everything okay? You seem tense." "Yes, everything's fine," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. "Just a lot going on." Jake frowned. He knew me well enough to sense when I wasn't telling the whole truth. "Emma?" His voice was serious now. "You know I notice everything, don't you?" "Notice what?" I snapped, louder than I intended. A few guests turned to look, and I felt my face flush. "Emma, stop," he hissed, his tone cold. "You've been acting strange since the moment we got here." I averted my gaze, pretending to focus on something across the room. But I knew he was right. My thoughts had been far from him, and he could feel it. "Sorry, it's just a lot of emotions. This house, my parents." I tried to smile. "It's probably just overwhelming." He didn't respond, just gave me a look that made me uncomfortable. There was distrust in his eyes, mixed with concern. And something else. Jealousy. Had someone said something to him? Or was he simply picking up on the tension I couldn't seem to hide? Mom approached the table, glowing with happiness. "Emma, Jake, how's everything? Are you enjoying yourselves?" she asked, topping off everyone's wine. Jake smiled, but it was strained. "Everything's wonderful, Mom," he replied, avoiding my gaze. I picked up my glass to take a sip, but my hand trembled slightly. The tension in the room felt almost tangible. I was caught in a trap. Between Jake, whose suspicions were becoming more evident, and Eric, whose presence felt like a persistent whisper from the past. Later, as dinner was winding down, I found myself next to Jake again. He leaned close to my ear and spoke in a low, sharp voice. "We need to talk. After all of this." I nodded, feeling a tight knot form in my chest. I knew the conversation was inevitable. And worse still, I wasn't sure how I'd respond. The house was gradually quieting down. Some guests had already left, while others lingered at the table, chatting in subdued tones. The lively energy of the evening had dissipated into a calmer, almost fatigued atmosphere. When Mom asked me to fetch another bottle of wine from the cellar, I gladly seized the opportunity to have a moment alone. The wine cellar in my parents' house had always felt like a hidden sanctuary, a cool, quiet place to retreat from the noise. I descended the creaky wooden stairs, feeling the air grow colder around me. The dim glow of a single bulb cast faint shadows on the stone walls. I scanned the racks, searching for the bottle Mom had described, when I heard footsteps behind me. My chest tightened and I turned sharply. "Eric?" My voice came out louder than I intended. He stood in the doorway, a slight smile on his face, but his eyes betrayed a deeper intensity. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The space immediately felt smaller, the tension thicker. "You knew I had to talk to you," he said softly, his gaze locked on mine. "Eric, not now," I said, taking a step back, though the confined space made it nearly impossible to create distance. "There are too many people upstairs." "This isn't about them, Emma," he interrupted. "It's about us. You feel it, I know you do." I closed my eyes briefly, willing the silence of the cellar to help me regain my composure. "There is no us," I said, but the words sounded weaker than I intended. "That's not true," he replied, his tone both insistent and tender. "You can pretend for everyone else, but not with me. I saw it on the terrace. I saw the way you looked at me tonight." He stepped closer, and I felt a deep tightening in my chest. His words, his presence. Everything about him chipped away at the defenses I had worked so hard to build. "Eric, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "I have a family, a husband. I've made my choice." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Are you sure it's your choice? Or just what was expected of you?" And then, he said the words that shattered the air between us. "I still love you." I stepped back, struggling to maintain control. "It doesn't matter," I said firmly. "I can't. We can't." I turned, intent on leaving, but he reached out, his hand barely brushing against mine. "Emma," he said, his voice raw with desperation. "If you feel even a shred of what I do, don't pretend it doesn't matter." I pulled away, grabbing the first bottle of wine I could reach. His words rang in my ears as I climbed back up the stairs, forcing myself to act as though nothing had happened. But inside, I felt the weight of what had just unfolded, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. The night at my parents' house felt unbearably long. I lay in the room where I had slept as a child, but sleep refused to come. Jake was beside me, his breathing even and calm. He had fallen asleep as if nothing had happened, while I felt like a stranger even in his presence. Thoughts of Eric wouldn't leave me alone. His words, his voice, his touch in the cellar. They lingered, preventing me from finding peace. Finally, I gave in. Quietly, so as not to wake Jake, I slipped on a coat and left the house. The cool night air enveloped me immediately, but I kept walking, as if in a trance, not knowing exactly where I was going. My feet carried me to the beach nearby. The moonlight reflected on the still surface of the water, and the gentle sound of waves created a nearly hypnotic atmosphere. I wrapped my arms around myself, staring into the endless darkness of the sea, trying to summon the strength to suppress the emotions threatening to tear me apart. "I didn't think you'd be here," a voice sounded behind me. I spun around sharply. Eric stood a short distance away, his figure silhouetted against the night sky. He looked as if he too couldn't sleep, as if something had drawn him here just as it had drawn me. "Eric," I exhaled, unable to hide my surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for some quiet," he said, stepping closer. "And I found you." Emma, you can't just walk away from all of this. We both know that. What are you talking about? My voice trembled, but I tried to appear calm. He took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. You can keep telling yourself it doesn't mean anything, but I know how you feel. This isn't just the past, is it? I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. Eric, this is wrong, I whispered, stepping back, but the sand beneath my feet made it difficult to move. Wrong? He let out a bitter laugh, though his voice held pain. Then tell me you feel nothing. Say it and I'll leave. Eric, I whispered again, but the word carried neither protest nor conviction. He leaned in, and I felt his breath on my lips. The kiss was brief. I didn't resist. I responded, letting myself forget everything for a fleeting moment. There, under the moonlight, with only the sea as a witness, we let the night envelop us, surrendering to everything we'd been trying to deny. The house greeted me with silence. Everyone was asleep, and even the dim nightlight in the hallway barely lit the way. I entered our room quietly, hoping Jake was still asleep so I wouldn't have to explain anything. But his voice, sharp and unexpectedly loud, stopped me at the door. Where were you? I just couldn't sleep. I tried, but my voice betrayed me. I went for a walk. A walk? At 2 a.m? He stood up slowly, his voice low but filled with suspicion. Emma, what's going on? Nothing. Everything's fine, I replied, trying to sound confident, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Jake took a step closer, his face dark with intensity. You've been different since we got here. You avoided me all evening. I can feel something's wrong. Are you going to tell me the truth? It's just this house. The memories, it's all a lot, I said, hoping he'd accept the excuse. I haven't been here in so long, and it's overwhelming. That's all. Overwhelming? His eyes narrowed. Emma, that doesn't explain you disappearing in the middle of the night, or how you acted during dinner. Were you with him? He asked directly. I looked up sharply, unable to hide my shock. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew something. With who? I tried to buy time, but my voice faltered. With Eric, he said, the name cutting through the air like a blade. Do you think I don't see how he looks at you? How you look at him? I sank onto the edge of the bed, my throat tightening. Denying it felt pointless, but admitting it? That seemed impossible. Nothing happened, Jake, I finally said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Nothing that would change anything. He stared at me for a long time as though weighing my words. But you thought about it, he said quietly, and the silence hit harder than any shout could have. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words crash over me. I need to figure things out, I whispered. This isn't about you. It's about me. Jake didn't move. His face remained still, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging inside him. Figure it out, Emma, he said, his voice bitter but restrained. But while you're doing that, think about whether you want to be with me. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. He grabbed a pillow and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with a guilt I couldn't justify or escape. Morning came heavy, as if the night had been filled with lead instead of air. Jake avoided me, sitting silently in the kitchen with his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. His distance was almost palpable. I knew the conversation we'd had the night before had left a fracture in our relationship, but I didn't have the strength to mend it. Not yet. Eric, as if sensing this was his last chance, called. His voice was calm, but there was a hidden plea in his tone. We need to talk, he said. I can't leave without knowing you've truly made up your mind. I knew meeting him was a risk. It could destroy what was left of everything. But I also understood that I couldn't move forward until I closed this chapter once and for all. A chapter that Eric and I, and even Jake were waiting for me to end. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Eric was already there, sitting by the window. When I walked in, he stood to greet me, but his expression was too tense to pass for calm. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down across from him. "This is the last time, Eric," I replied, trying to set the tone immediately. "I'm here to put everything in its place." He nodded, but a flicker of hope crossed his face. "I understand, but before you do, just answer one question for me. Be honest." I clasped my hands on the table, feeling a wave of anxiety rise in my chest. "Are you truly happy with him? With Jake?" he asked. I looked into his eyes, searching for the courage to answer truthfully. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. "I was happy," I finally said, "but it's a complicated happiness. Full of compromises, doubts, the kind of happiness most people probably have." Eric leaned closer, his voice softer now. "But is that what you wanted? Don't you deserve something real? Something that makes you feel alive?" His words hit me hard, but I knew I had to remain firm. I had already seen the destruction that could unfold if I let myself give in. "Eric," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, "what we had was real, but it's no longer our life. Now, I have to think not just about myself, but about Jake and what we've built together." His face tensed, but he said nothing. I could see the conflict in his eyes, a battle between the desire to convince me and the realization that I had already made my choice. "You still matter to me," I continued, "but whatever feelings we have, no matter how real they are, they could destroy lives. I can't let that happen." Eric was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if acknowledging my decision. "I'd want to be selfish and tell you that you're wrong," he finally said. "But you're right. Sometimes love means knowing when to let go." Those words struck me harder than I expected. I looked at him, my emotions in turmoil. But I knew this was the only right decision. "Goodbye, Eric," I whispered, standing up. "Goodbye, Emma," he replied, his voice carrying more pain than he intended to show. I walked out of the cafe, the air feeling heavier against my chest. Yet deep down, there was a strange sense of relief. I had done what I needed to do. Now I had to take the next step, to go back to Jake and try to mend what was still salvageable. The house greeted me with the same silence, but now it felt different. Not oppressive, but soothing, like a calm after a long storm. Jake was sitting in the living room, his gaze fixed on the window. It seemed he had been waiting for me. I sat down on the couch next to him, feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing on me. I knew this was the moment I couldn't let pass. "Jake," I began quietly, my voice barely steady. "We need to talk." He turned to look at me, and his eyes held everything. Pain, disappointment, worry, but also a faint glimmer of hope. "I'm listening," he said simply, his tone calm, though I could sense the effort it took him to keep his emotions in check. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I've been confused," I admitted. "This house, the memories, Eric, all of it stirred up something I thought I'd left behind, and I let myself doubt what we have." Jake frowned but remained silent, giving me the space to continue. "But today, I realized," I said, my heart pounding. "I realized that it wasn't real life. It was an illusion, a temptation from past dreams that never came true. With Eric," I hesitated, seeing Jake tense. "There was nothing. Nothing happened between us. But I can't deny that I felt something. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make me question things."